Welcome to The Wire. We have with us today Dr. Faisal Devji, Professor of History at St. Anthony's College, University of Oxford. Dr. Devji is interested in Indian political thought as well as that of modern Islam, and he's written several books, including The Impossible Indian, Gandhi and the Temptation of Violence. Over 70 years after he was assassinated, Mahatma Gandhi continues to have a presence in our polity. His ideas are increasingly relevant in our times, but his reputation has gone through several knocks in recent years. Africans have accused him of racism. Some Indians have found fault with his attitudes towards Dalits and especially his relationship with Dr. Ambedkar. The Hindutva right wing, which has always abhorred what he stood for, has tried to appropriate him, but reduced him to little more than a symbol of cleanliness. How has all this affected his reputation? And is the criticism directed at Gandhi even warranted? Professor Devji, welcome to The Wire. We expect you to address some of these questions and also put Gandhi in perspective in today's modern context. So I begin with asking you, why is Gandhi under such relentless attack, even while President Barack Obama calls him such an inspiration to his life?
Well, I suspect that what we are seeing is it's an ambiguous thing that we are seeing. On the one hand, as you suggest, he is under attack both in India and abroad, for the first time really abroad. He has been under attack in India since his own lifetime by a number of different groups. So there's nothing new there. Now, some of these groups have achieved political dominance in India today, so there is something novel in this respect. But we see criticism of Gandhi abroad for the first time since his death, really, of a significant kind. Of course, in Gandhi's earlier career, he had been much criticized by the British in particular because he was seen as being their enemy. But the new criticism is considerably different. It's on the left, it's among progressives. It's no longer on the right wing, as it had been in the past. In India, it is both on the right and on the left. So there's been a kind of shift in perspectives on Gandhi, both in India and abroad. And I suspect one of the things that's happening is that he's being very gradually displaced from his position as a national icon. And therefore, he's being received abroad as well as something other than a representative of India. Now, there are both good and bad things about this, because I think one of the problems we have with Gandhi as an iconic figure is that he has been, from the time of his death, too closely associated with the Indian nation state. Now, this is understandable because, after all, he was the father of the nation, was widely understood as being the father of the nation, and we could not really think about India's independence without him. It's not an illegitimate thing for Gandhi to have become an icon of the state. Yet at the same time, being an icon of the state is doing a disservice to Gandhi's own ideas and practices. After all, in the last years of his life, indeed from the 1930s, Gandhi had refused to be even a member of the Indian National Congress. And in his last years, he dissociated himself from the political work of the Congress Party, not because he disapproved of it, but because he thought that its success allowed him to return nonviolence to the site in which it truly belonged, in society, amongst individuals, as a universal possibility and not simply as a part of the rhetoric and struggle for independence. So the irony of the situation is that as Gandhi was distancing himself from formal or institutional political life, the more he tried to do that, the more he was actually linked up to it. And so after he dies, he becomes not only the national father, he is, in a great statement of irony, even put on the currency bills of the new Indian nation state. For a man who disliked money and possessed none, that truly is an act of irony and certainly a disservice to his memory. So I think that his disembedding with the victory of the BJP is disembedding from the status of a national icon. He remains, of course, a national icon in many other ways, has allowed Gandhi to assume a new life and a new character. And some of this new life is a disturbing one for many of us. He's accused of being a racist, a sexist, and a casteist, and there might be some truth in all these accusations. On the other hand, it is also an opportunity because Gandhi has been freed up for the first time in many decades. And so the fact that he is being invoked by all kinds of people in all kinds of ways is not necessarily a bad thing. Indeed, it shows us that he continues to be a living figure. Precisely when he is ejected from his status as the unrivaled national icon of India, does it become possible for people around the world to think about him differently? That poses, as I said, a danger and a risk as much as an opportunity for people on the right and on the left. So I see things in rather more positive terms than otherwise.
But Faisal, that may be, I think, a singular view in a sense, because the relentless attacks on him may actually end up maybe humanizing him, maybe putting him in some kind of perspective. We'll be able to examine him with warts and really come to appreciate what his role was and what kind of person he was. But there is a danger that he will be, in the end, belittled, because the efforts of his detractors, his modern day detractors, are not necessarily to say, okay, he's on a pedestal, let's take him down, which of course was done literally, but say, listen, this man is not what he claimed he was or what you think he was. He is an unremitting racist, sexist, etc. Plus, he has now been reduced to, he gave away India to Pakistan. So there's a danger he might be reduced to a caricature or dehumanized completely.
Well, for a man who himself said that one's ego should be reduced to dust, this is not necessarily a bad fate, in the sense that I'm not sure Gandhi himself would have minded so much. And of course, I would also suggest that though his critics may seek to, you're right, demean and belittle him, in fact, they require his presence. They need him for their own arguments. So the more they seek to belittle him, the more actually they make him loom large in history. He can become, in other words, a villain more than simply be dismissed. And being a villain is still being a major figure in history. So I don't think Gandhi will lose that status. He moves from hero to villain, and it's a parallel move, if you will. It's because heroes and villains are equivalents in many ways. Of course, we might prefer that he was one rather than the other, but I don't think he's going away anytime soon, because his critics cannot do without him. In that sense, we should be thankful to them, because Gandhi's admirers and friends are not doing so much to represent him as an important historical figure. Not that they don't write books about him. There are many, including, as you said, I myself, who have done so. But that doesn't really, an academic book doesn't really do that much for Gandhi in the public life of a nation, or indeed in the public life of a global society. So in some ways, we should be thankful to his critics because they also allow us to open up new perspectives on the man. I don't mean simply in order to humanize him. That, Gandhi had become a really straightened figure because he had become a national icon, that we were only allowed to think about him in certain ways, whereas he's a much more interesting man than what we were led to believe. When I started rereading Gandhi in his own words, I was astounded at the range and the variety of his thinking. It always, and it was never saintly in the sense that he always, as it were, walked on the knife's edge. And I think very deliberately, there's a degree of ambiguity in Gandhian thought precisely because there is a great deal of ambiguity in any attempt at moral life. It must walk the razor's edge. And that's what Gandhi did in his personal practice and in his ideas. And it's the risk-taking of the man that I find really fascinating. He called himself very often a gambler. He said, as a Banya, I am, of course, a gambler, which is a typically ambiguous statement by him. Because, of course, Banyas might not think of themselves as gamblers necessarily. And being a gambler is not always, if ever, a positive identity to have. So he was quite ironic in his deployment of these kinds of terms and what he did to them with himself in terms of his own identity, as well as the identities of his fellow Indians.
So interesting you should mention the Banya part of it, which he referenced, because Mr. Amit Shah called him a Chatur Banya, yes, and said it in the context of Gandhi saying that the Congress should wither away, it should fold up. And Mr. Shah touched upon that and picked that up. And there's been a lot of cherry picking going on, I suppose, on all sides. But the current dispensation has tried to say that he was, committed to cleanliness, used his famous glasses symbolism to show that he can be the symbol and the mnemonic, as it were, of the cleanliness campaign. Then I recently read an article, and there have been other pieces also by an RSS ideologue who said that the relationship between the RSS and Gandhi was very, very close. So there is a kind of, while we may look at it as something that essentially may have positive outcomes, there is an attempt to still link him with an ideology which essentially abhorred and which in turn led to his ultimately to his assassination.
I mean, the thing about Gandhi is, as a matter of principle, he thought that it was possible and indeed desirable and necessary to engage with everyone, especially your own enemies, because no one was bereft of the possibility of conversion, what he called conversion. And in order to do that, you had to engage with them, not necessarily in dialogue so much, but by representing in yourself the ideals you stood for as honestly and as transparently as possible, in a sacrificial manner, in fact. But I find it interesting that, his own erstwhile enemies, the RSS intellectual you mentioned, should also want to claim, as it were, a piece of Gandhi himself, which goes back to the point I made earlier, that even his enemies depend upon him in so many ways. Gandhi himself used to say that evil itself depends upon goodness. And he used for this a very nice example from the Mahabharata, where you have the two rival armies of the Pandavas and the Kauravas. And he says, look at the Kaurava army. It's an evil army. Its evil prince, Duryodhana, is intent only on conquest for his own personal ambition. And yet his army only holds together because of the virtues of its soldiers. Because any army, even the most evil, would not survive a minute if its soldiers were unwilling to sacrifice their lives for each other, to defend each other, to be brave, to be courageous, to have loyalty. These are all indubitable virtues, Gandhi said. So Duryodhana actually is not in control of his own army in many respects. And what the army can do, and that army, as we know, was full of important people with many virtues, like Bhishma, like Karna, and like Drona, right? So what that army needs to do, and the army represents us all, as it were, is to withdraw cooperation, to non-cooperate with the evil. And if that happens, then evil will collapse of its own accord. So in a way, the fact that Gandhi's enemies depend upon him is a nice illustration of what he himself used to say, that evil depends upon goodness. And this meant for Gandhi that precisely because of this, it was possible to convert one to the other. Evil could become goodness. So again, it is distressing, of course, to read and hear outright lies about someone who is an important historical figure, who certainly merits criticism on many counts. That is not an issue, but who doesn't deserve being dragged in a kind of entirely false way through, if I can use this description, intellectual gutters. To say that partition only became possible because of Gandhi, or that India did not emerge immediately as a superpower because of Gandhi, or that it could have become independent earlier if it was not for Gandhi. These are absurdities. No credible historian can make such claims. And yet they are made all the time. So what worries me is not the diminution of Gandhi that they entail, but the fact that the intellectual culture of Indian and other public life that entertains such ideas is, how should I put it, degraded or decadent in its own right. That is the more worrying phenomenon. Gandhi's place in history is assured. He's dead. But worrying is the fact that they are able, his enemies, to make such arguments. They could be good arguments to make against Gandhi. These are not good arguments.
So among the other arguments, and I will just touch upon it briefly because I want to move on to his current relevance, is his racism as seen by not just Africans, but perhaps elsewhere too. And in that entire spree of statue demolitions in the last couple of years, his went to in the University of Ghana. Then, the claims that he was somehow anti-Dalit, and the proof of that, the evidence of that is that he clashed with Dr. Ambedkar. Now, his clashes with Dr. Ambedkar are fairly widely known. It's not as if. And there were enough people within the Congress system also who were unhappy with him. So, but are these really tenable? I know that you have mentioned something about the racism in the past. So, you could just throw some light on, are these really strong, credible arguments?
Well, let me begin with racism, because that is the way in which the criticism of Gandhi has gone global. It's mostly through the issue of race. There was a bit of it from the 1980s when Gandhi was accused of being a sexist and treating his own wife badly. And that criticism made its way abroad, but only in university campuses, as far as I know. When I was a student, I heard it. And, the first thing to say is that every now and then there are intellectual and, if you will, public fashions and by using the word fashion, I don't mean to demean it, so that there was a time in the 1980s when you have a new feminist kind of consciousness evolving. And it's in this context that Gandhi becomes important then, right? In the 1990s and in the post-Mandal period in India, where caste becomes important anew, because for the first time you had significant caste politics that is autonomous happening. Of course, you have Kanshiram and you have Mayavati in Uttar Pradesh, right? So that provides a new context in which Gandhi's casteism gets to be discussed. Similarly, in our own time, race has become again a big issue globally. And so Gandhi's name has appeared there as well. So in a way, these three moments have not that much to do with Gandhi himself. He has been included within these new intellectual and polemical contexts. And the fact that he has been included in them is interesting because, again, it shows that it's actually very difficult to think about modern history without Gandhi. So you might want to dismiss him as irrelevant, but he keeps coming back, even as an enemy, Now, let me say something about these two matters, the race and caste. We can touch on the gender issue if we have time, because you have not mentioned it. On race, what I find interesting is that I'm perfectly willing to entertain the idea that Gandhi was a racist, but my argument is that you can't really tell that simply from his words. Why do I say this? Because the words and indeed the actions of Gandhi that are adduced to prove his racism are in fact made in their own context. Their context is that of a lawyer for the, if you will, Banya classes of Indians in South Africa. Right? Gandhi is employed to go and work for them. They are being attacked from the end of the 19th century and their privileges reduced in a South Africa that is increasingly being defined, legally being defined in racialized terms. So it's through the language of race that Indians are being pushed out of privileges, including quite basic ones like being able to ride on a tram with white people, or walk on the footpath with white people. Gandhi himself used to be pushed off these footpaths, as we know. Now, these are racially defined forms of discrimination. As long as Gandhi was a lawyer who had to argue his case for Indians, for the Indian capitalist class in South Africa in court, of course, the only way he can argue his case is by saying that Indians are in fact not racially inferior. He has to maintain and protect their privileges in a court of law, which itself depends upon racial reasoning. So Gandhi's reasoning must also be racial. The moment he stops being a lawyer and arguing his case for the Indian bourgeoisie in legal terms, he stops using racist language, as far as I can tell. This has not struck any of Gandhi's critics, though it should be the first thing that any historian should look at. What exactly is the context in which these statements are being made? They easily read his statements as being just transparent illustrations of Gandhi's true thoughts. Now, will you really take the words of a lawyer as a transparent illustration of the innermost thoughts? Now, not everything Gandhi is saying on race, of course, happens in court. He's writing in his journal, he's talking to people, but this is the context. It is to protect the racially defined privileges of Indians. Now, one wishes that he had sought to protect the privileges. There were no privileges, or it sought to protect Africans from the onslaught, the racialized onslaught that they faced. But that was not what he was employed to do, whatever his inner thoughts were. When you look at his work otherwise, when he returns to India and he writes Satyagraha in South Africa, his book, for instance, that book begins with an invocation of the nobility of the African as opposed to the Indian. And he's doing so because he wants to contest racist Indian stereotypes of Africans. He says, and he's talking about Zulus in particular, that they are far cleaner, far more noble, far more courageous, far more honest than Indians. Right? And that Indians should not presume to look down upon them. The language in which this is done is an Edwardian language. It's not the language we would use today. So it might strike us as being slightly odd, but it wasn't odd for his time, except for the fact that it is anti-racist. So again, this is not something that his critics look at, strangely. Now, having said that, I want to return to the words I began with, which is that he may well have been racist. I'm not making a categorical assertion that he wasn't. All I'm saying is that as a historian, we actually need to read his words much more carefully than we have been. That there is a kind of slapdash manner in which people have just grabbed at, cherry-picked his words, as you put it, to use your terms. And I'm not sure if this is a particularly useful thing to do. I would actually appreciate a much more sophisticated and clear account of race and racial feeling. And what that would actually force a reasonable historian to do is to think about how Indian notions of race and racism are manifested. They're not the same as European notions, for instance. I myself was born and brought up in East Africa, so I know that Indian visions of race and racist narratives, of which there are many, are very peculiarly and particularly inflected. They don't necessarily come out of European ideas of biological race. They come out of caste ideas very often, and they use terms that don't have much meaning in terms of in the context of European forms of racism. For instance,
sorry, go ahead.
I said, for instance, describing Africans by terms that are used to describe the friends of Krishna, the Lord Krishna, in Gokul. Cowherd. So normally this is a term that is a term of great reverence, but it is also used for Africans, pastoralist, and it's used in a derogatory fashion by many Gujaratis. Nevertheless, it has an alternative genealogy. This is not the genealogy of scientific racism and biology. So at the very least, a historian who wants to look at Gandhi's racism needs to look at the language of race in Gujarati and in Hindi and in other Indian languages, and how it was deployed. But no one has even done that.
So this kind of, let's say, one-sided, in a manner of speaking, ideologically driven criticism of him being anti-Dalit would also be what your argument could be applicable there too, because I think most of the critiques I've read, not all perhaps, have been a little flimsy in saying that this is what he wrote and present it as is. That he was,
it's interesting because Gandhi is certainly paternalistic at the very least towards Dalits. And he doesn't seem to understand the nature of indignity and degradation on many occasions. Nevertheless, he is the first congressman, the first Indian politician, in my view, and I'm not the only one to say this, who places untouchability and caste discrimination at the very heart of his program. No one else did it before him. For him, now you may argue that he did it for the wrong reasons, that all he wanted to do was to, as it were, absorb Dalits into Hindu society rather than risk their conversion to other religions. But that's another question. The claim I'm making, and I'm not the only one to make it, is that he's the first Indian politician who says that we cannot have Swaraj if we do not address this taint, this extraordinarily vile form of discrimination and degradation. That cannot be taken away from him. Right? Now, secondly, his relations with Ambedkar. They are, of course, polemical and hostile, and there is good reason for them. But again, just as I was saying for Gandhi in South Africa, how do you see him as a lawyer arguing his case? You can say this for Ambedkar as well, who was also a lawyer arguing his case, not necessarily in the courts, but in the, if you will, in the court of public opinion. Ambedkar has to make his case. He is audacious in a good sense. You know, he decides that he's going to do nothing less than attack the man who's coming to be the father of the nation. Take him off his pedestal. And this is a way of making sure that Ambedkar's cause cannot be dismissed. It should be front and center. Right? So the political role and the political program of Ambedkar is certainly an important one. But again, we needn't simply take it for granted that everything Ambedkar said as a political figure, like everything Gandhi said as a political figure, is necessarily what either man, transparently thought. That there are contexts for all of these polemics. And so I would offer, for instance, as an example, a countervailing example, here, the fact that Ambedkar, who seems certainly genuinely to have had no patience for Gandhi, nevertheless continues to use the arch-Gandhian term satyagraha. That is a term invented more or less by Gandhi. Ambedkar uses it to the end of his life. Even after Gandhi is dead, he continues to do satyagraha. So he has learned something from Gandhi, and he has taken a Gandhian term for it. And it's not like he doesn't know this. He knows this full well. So again, it's a complex relationship. It is not a friendly relationship. I do not want to say that. But Gandhi, Ambedkar, and others during this period are engaged in a kind of conversation with each other. In order to engage in a conversation, you have to share some terms in common. There is speech possible. And as we know, during the famous or infamous Pune Pact, Ambedkar does in fact speak with Gandhi and negotiate with Gandhi. And that's where the policy of reservations for Dalits, it comes out of those discussions. Eventually, Ambedkar repudiates them because he thinks that had Gandhi not forced him to withdraw from the communal award that the British had given, in which Dalits were granted separate electorates, just as Muslims and Hindus had separate electorates, that Dalits would be better off with separate electorates. Now you see that there's a larger picture here, obviously. And again, this is a big problem because those who focus on Gandhian caste tend to take the caste issue and remove it completely from the communal issue. Whereas in fact, they're completely connected. The separate electorates are given in something called the communal award, and they extend to Dalits the separate electorates that Muslims had previously been given, and by extension, therefore, Hindus by default. So these two things are connected. You cannot take them apart. When Gandhi is arguing against separate electorates, he cannot really argue against Muslims because they already have the separate electorates before Gandhi even got back to India from South Africa. But he can prevent separate electorates from defining the entirety of Indian politics by denying them to Dalits. Is there an injustice in that denial? Very possibly, very likely. And this is where Ambedkar focuses. But you cannot understand this matter without taking into consideration both the communal award and therefore communalism, but also the fact that it comes out of the Minorities Pact at the Round Table Conference in London, in which Ambedkar sides with the Muslim League. Later on, he breaks with the Muslim League. But this is the story of politics. There are alliances and there are breaches of alliances. You cannot read from one fragment or from one period or from one event the entirety of any particular individual's position.
Now, toward the end, I just wanted to take us to the international situation. We are seeing right-wing demagogues who've taken over their countries in the most democratic manner. One has just been finally forced to step down, as it were, because left to himself. You saw what happened in the last couple of weeks. And there was violence in the United States Capitol. There's a lot of communal violence within India, elsewhere too. Surely, with all this, there is an argument to say Gandhi's ideas today look very, very outdated, because you need new paradigms to imagine and think about how to address these things. At the same time, one could and one would argue to say many of his ideas are actually more relevant than ever before.
I agree with the latter statement that you made, because when you look, for instance, at just yesterday, now President Biden's inaugural speech, the amount of time he spent on violence and on the importance of nonviolence was extraordinary, especially for an American president. In a way, it was much more significant than anything Obama said, though Obama, as you noted, used to reference Gandhi. Biden, having experienced a riot at the very heart of the US legislature, at the very site of that riot, the Capitol, mentions violence and nonviolence. You cannot think of nonviolence without Gandhi. He dignifies it as a term. It has become a concept thanks to Gandhi. It is now at the heart of global concerns. That you have to give the man credit for. But it is not simply an inheritance. It is actually very, very important. I think one of the things we have seen in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, not least India, is that we can no longer rely as comfortably as we once did on the institutional forms of democracy. Political parties can be, like the Republican Party was, be taken over and hollowed out by outsiders, by adventurers, and be deployed against their own, as it were, better interests of the Republicans themselves. What does this mean? What does this tell us? It tells us, if you will, in a Gandhian way, that you cannot invest everything, not least nonviolence, in these institutional forms. As early as 1909 in his manifesto Hind Swaraj, Gandhi is very critical of parliamentary democracy, not because he doesn't like democracy, but because he sees its potential for corruption. And what he counsels is the importance of nonviolence as an individual and as a social form, that it is there where it really has work to do, which is why, returning to the first point I made, on the eve of India's independence, Gandhi doesn't participate in the celebrations, not only because of the partition of violence, but because he has already declared that once the state belongs to Indians, the role of nonviolence is going to be in the constructive program, right? In the elimination of caste discrimination, communalism, poverty in general, and in work for the vast majority of Indians who are poor, landless peasants. And no government policy which did not address them first should be worth considering in Gandhi's view. So that way in which he was able to both give rise to a new institutional democratic politics through a political party, Congress, but at the same time remove himself from it once it became, as it were, viable in its own right, I think tells us something very important. A, that we must not, we must understand the fragility of these institutional forms, but we must not at the same time place all, as it were, our eggs in its basket. That what is important is violence and non-violence, therefore, as an individual and a social responsibility, because only individuals and societies are able to create the context in which these institutional forms have meaning.
So finally, I've been meaning to ask you this question ever since your book came out. The opportunity hasn't presented itself so far. You called your book The Impossible Indian. And what I'd like to know is, did you mean impossible to slot or impossible to repress?
Well, both really, because I wanted to suggest by the title, the fundamental ambiguity. I want to come back to that point of Gandhi himself. You know, you can read him in more than one way, and that is the point of the man, because he does walk, a sword's edge. He's impossible both in the colloquial English sense of that word, to call someone, oh, you're just impossible, an irritating, eccentric, annoying perhaps, but always fascinating figure. But he's also impossible perhaps in another way, because the work of nonviolence it's a fraught enterprise, and it's full of risks and pitfalls. So as Gandhi himself was the first to realize, there are mistakes that are made, but those mistakes must be learned from. So yes, the title was there basically to suggest the fundamental ambiguity of the man, because what I didn't want to do is to write a hagiographical account of Gandhi. Not because I don't think he's an important man. Who can deny that he was an important man? Today, his enemies tell us more than his friends how important he was. That is a non-issue. I don't need to address that at all. It's this. It's the ambiguity and the ambivalence, the different possibilities and potentials that are so fascinating and so interesting about the man. And they're not only about the man. They tell us about who we ourselves are. Because as Gandhi always used to say, he said, is a nobody. He's the least of people. The importance of Gandhi is the fact that he's as weak as every one of us. Something he used to say. And it is in this way that we are identified with him, not because of his greatness, but because of his weakness. And this is what allows us to, as it were, identify with the man, learn not only what we could become, but what we shouldn't be.
So I'm going to just myself translate it as impossible to think of the world without thinking of him, and impossible to put away as a mere symbol. Thank you, Faisal Devji, for this really illuminating chat, which I think and I hope a lot of people see it, perhaps get a little provoked by it, and want to respond to you to say, you too perhaps are trying to answer their complaints and their criticisms. But that's what makes the man so fascinating, to us so many years later. Thank
Exactly.
you once again for joining us on The Wire.
Thank you very much, Sidharth.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.